Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm going to tell you about a man named Pieter van der Berg. He's 63 years old from Rotterdam, and he spent 35 years as a construction site foreman. Flood barriers, bridge foundations, the kind of infrastructure that's meant to last 100 years. He is not a naive man. He is not a romantic exactly. He is someone who spent his career reading structures and knowing, from the ground up, what would hold and what wouldn't. He'd also been through this before. Not Vietnam, somewhere else. A different country, a different woman, a different version of the same hope. He came home from that one lighter in the bank account and heavier everywhere else, and he told himself, the way men do, that he had learned what he needed to learn. He was wrong about that. And that's what this story is about. Not the first mistake, but the second one. The one you make after you think the first one has made you careful. This one is going to stay with you. Here's his story in his own words. I built things that were supposed to outlast me. That's the simplest way to say what I did for a living. Flood barriers on the Maas, bridge foundations in the Rotterdam port, infrastructure, the kind of work where if you get it wrong, people die. And if you get it right, nobody notices for 50 years. That suited me fine. I was never somebody who needed to be noticed. I retired at 61. 35 years in, and my knees were telling me something my pride wasn't ready to hear, so I listened to my knees. The pension came through, the AOW plus the sector pension, roughly 2,800 euros a month. And I thought, right, this is the part where it gets easy. You work your whole life so the end of it can be quiet and comfortable? That's the deal. The deal felt different in practice. It wasn't depression. I want to be clear about that because people reach for that word quickly, and it's not always accurate. It was more like, you know when you take the load off a structure and it's still standing, technically, but it's not doing anything anymore, it's just there. That's closer to what it felt like. I was still standing. I just wasn't load-bearing. My wife and I had separated years before. Amicably, more or less, which is another way of saying we'd stopped fighting about it by the time we made it legal. No children. The flat in Schiedam was mine. Small, sufficient, 2 plants that I didn't kill, which I considered an achievement. And then there was Thailand. I'm not going to spend a long time on Thailand because it's not the story, and also because I have told it enough times in my own head that I'm tired of the sound of it. I'll say this. I went to Phuket for a holiday at 57. I met a woman. I convinced myself I was in love. I moved there. She left. I was softer then. More willing to dress things up as what I wanted them to be rather than what they were. I lost money, not catastrophic amounts. Enough to be humiliating, not enough to be ruinous. I came home. I rented the Schiedam flat. I told everyone, including myself, that it was a learning experience. I believed that. I genuinely believed it. What I understand now, and what I didn't understand then, not properly, is that being burned once doesn't make you fireproof. It makes you someone who's developed a more sophisticated explanation for why the fire this time is different. I thought I'd gained judgment. What I'd actually gained was better arguments. I found Vietnam the way a lot of men my age find it. A forum. A comment thread under some travel article. Someone with a username I can't remember saying something like, Thailand's finished, all tourists and inflated prices, Vietnam is where it still is. And underneath that, a dozen men agreeing. I read through the whole thread. Then I found another thread. Then I watched some YouTube channels. This one actually among others, which is either ironic or appropriate, I'm not sure which. I did my research. I'm a methodical person. If I'm going to build something, I want to understand the ground I'm building on first. I read about Hanoi, about the visa situation, about the cost of living, about what you could rent for what you'd pay in Rotterdam. I read some of the cautionary stories too. I read them the way you read about bridge collapses when you're a bridge engineer. Professionally interested. Personally certain it wouldn't happen to you because you know what those other people did wrong. I booked a 3-week return ticket for early November. I told myself it was a tourist trip, an assessment. I was going to look, not to decide anything. That framing was important to me. I was a man going to look, with a return ticket already purchased, under no obligation to anything. I am telling you this so you understand the state I was in when I arrived. Not desperate. Not lonely in any way I would have named out loud. Just a man in a structure that was standing but not doing anything, with a return ticket and a very detailed plan to simply observe. The flight landed at Noi Bai at 6 in the morning. November in Hanoi is cool. Not cold by Dutch standards, but nothing like I'd expected from Southeast Asia. The airport was chaos at the taxi rank, the way airports always are, but within 20 minutes, I was on the highway into the city and it was, I don't know. There's a word in Dutch, gezellig, which doesn't translate well. It means something like warmly alive. That's what Hanoi felt like driving in at dawn, the motorbikes starting to fill the roads, a few street vendors already out, the city waking up around you rather than waking up at you, if that makes any sense. I stayed in a guest house in the old quarter for the first week. Small room, clean enough. A window that looked onto a narrow alley where a woman sold banh mi from a cart every morning starting at 6:30. I bought one every day. Pork, pate, pickled vegetables, some kind of chili sauce that took the roof off your mouth. 200,000 dong, about €7. I walked everywhere. I drank bia hoi at plastic tables on the pavement, paying 20,000 dong for a glass, which is less than €1, which I found mildly insane. The city felt, and I am choosing this word carefully, real. It felt like somewhere that was arranged around the people who lived in it, rather than around the people visiting it. After Phuket, which by the end had started to feel like a theme park with worse traffic, that mattered to me. I had my return ticket. I was simply observing. By the end of the first week, I had already started to wonder what it would cost to extend by a few days. In the second week, I moved my base of operations, as I thought of it, from the old quarter up to Tai Ho West Lake. A Dutch colleague who'd done some contract work in Hanoi years before had mentioned it. Quieter than the old quarter, he said. Less backpacker chaos, more residential. He was right. The streets around the lake were wider, lined with the kind of low trees that go golden in November, and in the mornings there was a mist off the water that sat at exactly the height of a man's chest. I found a small cafe on Tu Hoa Street. More of a house than a cafe, really, a family running it from their ground floor. 2 tables outside, cafe trung that they made with egg yolk and condensed milk, and something I never identified but suspected was nostalgia. I went there every morning. I was becoming a regular somewhere. I noticed this about myself. It was the 9th day of the trip. I had my paper map. I don't trust my phone data abroad. This is a personal policy, possibly outdated, definitely inconvenient. And I was working out how to get to Hoan Kiem without taking a grab, because I had decided to walk more. A woman at the next table said something in Vietnamese that I didn't understand, then switched immediately to English and asked if I needed help. Her name was Lynn. She was 31, though I didn't know that yet. She worked at a travel agency 3 streets away and came to this cafe on her lunch break because they had the best egg coffee in the neighborhood, which was not a boast, it was simply true. She spoke English carefully with long pauses between sentences, and she apologized for the pauses. Her English was, in fact, considerably better than she gave herself credit for. We talked for, I timed it afterward because I'm that sort of person, just over 2 hours. I want to be precise about what she was like because I think precision matters here, and I also think I owe her that. She was not what you might expect if you've spent time in places like Phuket, watching how these things sometimes operate. She did not flirt in any obvious way. She did not touch my arm. She did not ask in the first 20 minutes what I did for work or where I was staying. She asked what I thought of Hanoi, and when I said it felt real, she laughed and said, "That was a strange thing to say about a city." And then she thought about it for a moment and said she understood what I meant. She was from Ninh Binh originally, about 90 kilometers south of Hanoi. She'd come to the city for university, stayed for work, eldest of 4 children. She sent money home every month, a fixed amount, her contribution to the family's running costs. She told me this in the same tone she told me everything else, which was the tone of someone reporting facts about their life, without either hiding them or dramatizing them. It was, to my ears, the tone of an honest person. I think about that a lot now. Not with bitterness, with something more like professional respect for how completely I misread it. In my experience, when a person volunteers unflattering or complicated information about themselves early in a relationship, it signals integrity. It signals that they're not performing a version of themselves. What I did not adequately consider is that being told something plainly is not the same as being told everything, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The second week. The cafe on Tu Hoa Street. We exchanged numbers. Her contact name in my phone, I realize now, was just Lynn, Cafe Teho, as if I were filing a professional contact. I was, at this point, still maintaining the fiction of assessment. Still a man with a return ticket who was simply observing. She showed me parts of Hanoi that weren't on my map. Not in the romantic sense. She was not giving me a tour. She was just going places she normally went, and I was coming along. A bun cha spot down a hem near Zhongthan that had no sign outside and about 8 plastic stools where the charcoal smoke came off the grilled pork and settled in your jacket and stayed there for hours. A temple in Ba Jin she visited on weekday mornings, not to pray exactly, she said, but because it was quiet, and she liked to think there. The Zhong Xuan market, where she argued cheerfully in Vietnamese with a fabric vendor for about 5 minutes, and then bought nothing, and seemed perfectly satisfied with this outcome. She was comfortable with silence. I noticed this because it is relatively uncommon. We could sit across from each other for 10 minutes without talking, and it was not uncomfortable. She was also, now that I observed it, genuinely funny. Dry, understated, the kind of humor that doesn't announce itself. A Rotterdam woman might have had the same quality if I think about it. Whether that parallel meant something or whether I constructed it afterward, I honestly cannot say. I extended my ticket by 10 days. I told myself this was about Hanoi, not about Lynn. Both of those things contained some truth. By the time I actually did fly home, 5 weeks after I'd arrived, we had spent perhaps 15 of those days in some form of each other's company. Nothing dramatic had happened. No declarations, no overnight stays. We had eaten a lot of meals together and walked a significant distance, and had the kind of long, unresolved conversations you have when two people are still in the phase of explaining themselves to each other. I paid for everything without discussion. This was not a request on her part. It was simply what I did, and what she allowed, and neither of us named it. I came home to Schiedam in December. The flat was exactly as I'd left it. The 2 plants were alive. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked at the wall for a while. Within 48 hours, I'd booked a return flight for February. I want to say something here because I think it's important. There was nothing calculated about how I felt. I was not a naive person who had never been to Southeast Asia or had never encountered the stories. I had read the forums. I knew the shape of the thing as it usually went. And what I told myself, what I genuinely believed, was that I knew the shape well enough to recognize it. And this was a different shape. She had not approached me. She had not asked me for anything. She had a job, a family, a real life that existed entirely independently of whether I was in it. These were my criteria, built from the rubble of Thailand, and she met all of them. The criteria were not wrong exactly. They were just insufficient. But I didn't know that yet. I booked the February flight. I started sending voice notes on Zalo because that's what she used, and I learned to navigate the interface with the same methodical patience I brought to learning new site management software. She replied at variable intervals, sometimes within minutes, sometimes after several hours. I noted the variability and filed it as a cultural observation and moved on. I was being thoughtful, considered. I was not the men in the forums. That was the story I was telling myself in December, alone in Schiedam, planning a return trip with the diligence of a man who has learned from his mistakes. February in Hanoi is a different city. November had been golden and cool, the kind of weather that flatters everything. February is gray and damp, a thin drizzle that isn't quite rain, the kind that gets into your collar without you noticing until you're already cold. I arrived at Noi Bai on a Thursday afternoon and took the now familiar highway into the city and thought, yes, still the right place. The gray didn't bother me. I grew up in Rotterdam. I know gray. Lynn met me at the apartment I'd booked near Tai Ho, a different place than the guest house, a proper short-stay apartment, 2 rooms, a small kitchen, a view of the street below where a man sold bon kuan from a cart every morning, and a woman across the alley hung laundry at 6 a.m., regardless of the weather. Lynn stood outside the building in a gray coat, hands in her pockets. She looked exactly as I remembered her, which surprised me slightly, because in my experience, memory tends to either inflate or diminish people, rarely gets them right. We walked to a po place she knew on Ungi Tom, 10 minutes from the lake, sat down, ate, and somewhere in the middle of that meal, I couldn't tell you which moment exactly, we stopped being 2 people who had been on a kind of extended trial and became something with a definition. No conversation about it, no declaration, just the quiet shift of two people who have decided, without announcing it. I want to tell you what my reasoning was. I've thought about this a lot, and I think I owe it to you to be honest about the actual logic, not a softened version of it. I had a list. Not written down, I'm not that obsessive, but a list in my head that I had constructed, carefully from the wreckage of Thailand. Criteria. The things I would look for. The things that would tell me whether this was what it appeared to be. She had not approached me. This was first on the list and it mattered most. Every story I'd read, every cautionary account, started with the woman making contact. Lynn had not. I went to her. This seemed to me to be significant. She had a real job. Had a verifiable job. I had walked past her travel agency on Xuan Diu Street. I had seen her go in and come out. A real office, real colleagues, a boss she occasionally complained about. Not someone whose livelihood depended on foreign men. She had told me about the family money immediately, the monthly transfers to Ninh Binh. Most of the stories I'd read described women who concealed this obligation until the man was already committed, then revealed it piece by piece. Lynn had told me before she knew my last name. That mattered. She had never asked me for anything directly. Not once. Everything I'd spent on her, the meals, the transport, the incidentals, had been initiated by me. She had accepted, and she had allowed it. But she had not asked. She was comfortable with silence. This is not a financial criterion, I understand that. But in my experience, people who are performing a version of themselves cannot sustain silence comfortably. The performance requires noise, requires talking, requires the work of maintaining the fiction. She could sit across from me for 20 minutes without filling the space. I took this as evidence of genuine character. She laughed at things I found funny, specific things, dry observations, understated ironies. Not the performed laughter of someone who wants you to feel clever. The actual, slightly delayed laugh of someone who got it. I am laying all this out for you not to make myself look like an idiot, though perhaps that is a side effect. I'm laying it out because I think it's important that you understand the system was not irrational. Every item on that list was a reasonable criterion. Experienced men, men who had been around and thought carefully about risk, would have made a similar list. The problem, and I see this now with a clarity that was entirely unavailable to me at the time, is that the list was designed to detect the version of this situation that had already happened to me. It was detection equipment calibrated for the last threat. Lynn was a different shape entirely, but February was still good. I stayed 10 days. We took a weekend trip down to Ninh Binh, which was Lynn's idea, and she wanted me to see where she was from, outside of the compressed, polite version her family presented on video calls. We went by bus, 3 hours south, into a landscape of limestone karsts rising out of flat rice paddies, the kind of scenery that makes you feel geologically insignificant in a not unpleasant way. We hired a rowboat on the Trang Nguyen waterway, a local woman rowing us through the rock formations, while Lynn translated the history in a voice that made it clear she had heard all of this many times as a child. We stayed 2 nights at a small guest house and visited her family on the second day. The house was on a lane off the main road, modest, concrete, well-maintained. Her parents met us at the door. The father was thin and quiet, a man who had been strong once and was conserving what was left. The mother was warm in the way that provincial Vietnamese mothers tend to be with foreign guests, pressing food on you before you've sat down, asking through Lynn whether you found the food too spicy, whether the journey had been tiring. There was an altar in the main room with photographs and incense and fruit, the kind of family altar you see everywhere in Vietnamese homes, flowers and small offerings arranged with the particular care of something that gets tended every day. I am not a sentimental person by nature, but sitting in that room, eating a lunch her mother had clearly been preparing since early morning, watching the way Lynn spoke to her parents, gently with a deference that was nothing like how she spoke to me, I felt something I'm going to call conviction. The conviction that this was real, that the structure was sound. We spent perhaps 1,200 euros total across those 2 visits, including the trip to Ninh Binh and everything that came before. Meals, transport, the guest house. My money, naturally. I paid for things the way I would have paid for things with anyone I was seeing. Not as a transaction, just as the way you do it when you have more than the other person and the other person never fights you for the bill. At the time I considered this unremarkable, it was just what you do. I flew home from Neubai on a Sunday afternoon. Lynn stood at the drop-off area, so you can't go inside without a ticket. And she waved once when I looked back. Not dramatic, just a wave. I got in the queue and didn't look back again because I'm not the type. On the flight home, I found myself for the first time in several years thinking about the medium-term future in concrete terms. Not grand plans, just the quiet arithmetic of a man who has somewhere to return to. What it might cost to come back every 6 weeks. Whether the Dutch tourist visa situation would become complicated if I kept extending. Whether there were things I should understand about long-term arrangements. I got home. I did the laundry. I called my sister, who lives in Utrecht and has never asked me directly about any of my decisions because she is Dutch and we don't do that. I went to bed early. I had 2 months until April when I was planning to go back. The criteria on my list had all been met. The structure was sound. I had been careful. I was not those men. I say this still with a foreman's confidence. The confidence of a man who has read the blueprints and approved the materials and signed off on the foundations. The same confidence I had carried onto every major project for 35 years. It had never failed me on a bridge. I want to be clear about that. It had never, in 35 years of building things, led me wrong. Between February and April, I was in contact with Lynn most days. Voice notes on Zalo, mostly. She would send them in the morning, her time, early afternoon mine, a minute or two of her day, what she'd had for breakfast, something a customer at the travel agency had done that she found irritating, a question about Rotterdam that she'd thought of and didn't want to forget. They were ordinary messages. That was, I think now, part of what made them convincing. There's a particular texture to genuine daily life that is difficult to fabricate consistently, and her messages had that texture. Though sometimes they didn't come until evening, or not until the next morning, with a brief explanation that she'd been tired or had dinner with her younger sister who was visiting from Ninh Binh, or had simply fallen asleep early. I noted each gap, filed each explanation, told myself I was filing them as information, not as evidence of anything. I want to be honest about the phone situation because I think it matters. The gaps were there from the beginning. Not alarming, not 8, 10 hours of silence, but present. Inconsistent. A pattern without being obviously a pattern. And I had read on the same forums where I'd learned about Vietnam in the first place that Vietnamese communication culture is different. That the constant availability expected in Western relationships is not a universal norm. That demanding instant responses is a form of cultural imposition. So I read this, and I applied it, and I adjusted my expectations accordingly. And I am sitting here now, telling you that this adjustment was the most expensive thing I ever did. Not the money I transferred, the adjustment, the decision to interpret absence as cultural rather than as information. But April, third visit. I landed at Noi Bai in the second week of April and the city was warm now, properly warm. The kind of heat that hits you at the door of the plane and reminds you that you're in Southeast Asia regardless of how many November visits you've had. Lynn met me at the apartment. I was renting the same short-stay place near Tai Ho. It was cheaper to book it monthly now than by the week, and she had a key. That had happened gradually and naturally, the way most things with her happened. On the second evening, she mentioned, without particular emphasis, that her mother had been unwell. A few weeks prior. A clinic visit in Ninh Binh, some kind of blood pressure issue, medication prescribed. The cost had needed to be paid up front at the provincial clinic. That's how it works outside the cities. Cash before treatment, no exceptions. It had been handled, she said. It was fine now. Her mother was managing. She said all of this in the tone of someone providing an update, not making a request. She moved on to something else. I was the one who returned to it. I asked what the clinic had cost. She told me. 15 million dong. About 550 euros. I transferred it that evening from the flat on Tai Ho, sitting at the small kitchen table with a can of Bia Hanoi going warm beside me, the sound of a motorbike with a cracked exhaust going back and forth on the street below. 550 euros. I have authorized more than that on a single set of site survey tools without blinking. It did not feel like a significant moment. It felt like the obvious thing to do. And it was, in one sense. Her mother had genuinely had a clinic visit. The medication was real. I know this because I asked with what I thought was appropriate care rather than suspicion, and the details were consistent over subsequent conversations. I am not someone who wants to tell you that every dong of that money was cynically extracted. Some of it wasn't. Some of it was simply a foreigner with a construction pension and a savings account covering a medical bill that a travel agency salary couldn't easily absorb. The family obligation was real. The need was real. The question of whether the need would have existed in quite the same form without me, that I can't answer. By June, I had stopped booking the short-stay apartment by the week and started paying a monthly rate. 11 million dong and roughly 400 euros, which covered the place for the full month regardless of how long I was actually there. This made financial sense. I was coming back every 6 or 7 weeks, and the per-night rate was significantly higher. A foreman calculates unit costs. It was the rational decision. Lynn used the apartment when I wasn't there. This was understood. She didn't officially live there, she had her own place. But she kept things there, and she used the kitchen, and occasionally her sister would stay over when visiting from Ninh Binh. I contributed 6 million dong a month towards shared costs, utilities, the landlord's extra charges, incidentals. About 220 euros. We split it loosely, which is to say I paid it, and she managed the relationship with the landlord. Then the motorbike. Her younger brother, second youngest of the 4 siblings, worked in a factory in the Bac Ninh industrial zone, about 40 kilometers north of Hanoi. He'd been taking the bus, which was 2 hours each way, and the hours were irregular enough that he was sometimes missing the last bus and having to pay for XE that ate into his wages. He needed a motorbike, a used Honda Wave, 22 million dong, 800 euros roughly. Lynn told me this in the apartment one evening in July, sitting on the small sofa with her feet tucked under her, which is how she sat when she was going to tell me something she wasn't sure how to frame. She was not asking me directly. She was telling me the situation, explaining it as a family problem she was trying to work out how to solve on a travel agency salary while also sending money home monthly. I said I would cover it. She said she couldn't ask me to do that. I said she hadn't asked. And that was the transaction. 22 million dong transferred the following week. 800 euros. I had spent more than that on a Leica survey instrument in 2019 and thought nothing of it. The brother needed transport to get to work. This is not an abstract justification. It is simply what I believed and what I still partly believe. The brother existed. He worked in that factory. He probably did need the motorbike. I think about that evening now, the way she sat, the feet tucked under her. I have tried to reconstruct whether that posture was calculated, whether she knew exactly how to present a request as a non-request, and I genuinely cannot determine it. She may have known precisely what she was doing. She may have been telling me a real problem in the only way she had available to her, which was sideways, because asking directly would have been face-destroying for her in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. Both things can be true. I've had to learn to hold that. So, by the end of July, 8 months after I first landed at Noi Bai, the direct transfers came to roughly 9,000 euros, the mother's clinic bill, the apartment contribution across 4 months, the motorbike, various smaller things I'm rounding down because I can't remember every transaction, and I am trying to be accurate rather than either self-pitying or self-exculpatory. 8 flights at 650 euros each, 5,200. Accommodation and living costs across 4 visits. Call it 3,000. Total somewhere around 17,000 euros spent and the savings account still essentially intact, the pension still arriving every month. I was not alarmed. I want to be clear about this, because I think it's important that you understand the absence of alarm was not stupidity, or not only stupidity. I had done the arithmetic. I had compared it to the horror stories. The men in those stories had sent tens of thousands before they'd ever landed, had signed over property, had wired money to women whose faces they'd only seen on a phone screen. I had done none of that. I had been on 8 flights. I had met the family. I had held the mother's hand when she showed me photographs of her own mother on the family altar. I was not those men. I said this, word for word or close to it, to a British man I met at a craft beer place off Hang Bo in the Old Quarter during the July visit. He'd been in Hanoi 4 years, ran some kind of online business, had the look of a man who has made peace with something. I gave him the outline of the situation. Lynn, the family, the expenses, the care I'd taken. He listened, drank his beer, nodded slowly at appropriate moments. He didn't say, "You're one of those men." He didn't say anything specific at all, actually, just nodded. And when I finished, he said something like, "Sounds like you've thought it through and changed the subject." I interpreted this as agreement. I filed it under independent confirmation that the structure is sound. I have since revised that interpretation significantly. By August, I had a routine. This is the part one find most difficult to explain to people who haven't been in this situation. Because from the outside, a routine sounds like comfort. And from the inside, it felt like exactly that, like something settled and real. Fly into Hanoi, take the familiar route, drop my bag at the apartment on Tai Ho, get a coffee trunk from the family cafe on Tu Hoa Street within the first hour. The woman who ran it knew my order. She didn't speak English and I didn't speak Vietnamese, but she brought the egg coffee without being asked and I paid without counting the change, and this small, wordless transaction felt absurdly like belonging somewhere. I had made 5 visits by then. I had met Lynn's siblings, the brother with the motorbike, now working the back Nin factory shifts with apparent reliability, the 2 younger sisters, one still studying in Hanoi, one back in Ninh Binh helping with the parents. I had eaten at the family table in Ninh Binh 3 times. I knew which photographs were on the altar and roughly who each person was. I knew that Lynn's father took his tea very sweet, and that her mother kept a small radio in the kitchen tuned to a station that played old Vietnamese ballads while she cooked. In Thailand, I was always a guest. That is the honest word for what I was. A guest in a life that continued entirely without me when I wasn't present. With Lynn, I felt woven into something. Peripheral, perhaps, but present. Connected. I thought about this distinction a great deal and drew from it a great deal of unwarranted confidence. The roof conversation happened on the 5th visit in August. We had driven down to Ninh Binh for the weekend. Lynn borrowed a colleague's car, which she drove with the focused efficiency she brought to most practical tasks. And on the Sunday morning, we were sitting in the courtyard behind her parents' house, drinking tea while her mother was inside. Lynn looked up at the roof and said, without particular drama, that it needed to be replaced before the rainy season. The tiles were original. Some were cracked. Some had shifted. When it rained heavily, there was water inside. Her father had looked into the cost of materials. Labor they could largely manage through family connections, an uncle and 2 cousins who did this kind of work. But the materials were the problem. Roof tiles, timber for the framing, weatherproofing compound. She'd been putting aside what she could from her salary, but the rainy season was coming in October, and she was still short. She told me the figure her father had worked out. 120 million dong, approximately 4,400 euros. She was not looking at me when she said this. She was looking at the roof. Now, I want to be precise here because I've thought about this moment many times, and I think it matters exactly how it happened. She did not ask me. She told me the problem. She told me what it would cost. She said she was still short. And then she was quiet, and I said, I'll cover it. She started to say something, the beginning of a refusal, the way she always began these conversations. Well, that brief performance of reluctance that I had come to find reassuring rather than suspicious. I said, it's a roof. You don't defer a roof. I know what happens when you defer a roof. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. I transferred the money the following week from Shidam. 120 million dong, converted at the current rate. 4,400 euros leaving my account, and arriving somewhere in the Ninh Binh banking system, I assume. I did not ask for receipts. I did not ask for photographs of the completed work, which I eventually did receive anyway. Sent without prompting, the new tiles a slightly different shade from the surrounding wall, the kind of small visual mismatch you always get when you repair rather than replace entirely. I looked at those photographs and I thought, practical result, solid outcome, money well spent. I am a man who spent his career authorizing material expenditures. I understood, in the most bone-deep professional way, that a building needs a sound roof. This was not a foreign concept deployed to manipulate me, it was a structural reality. And the fact that it was also a structural reality is part of why it worked so well. Because I could apply my own expertise, my own hard professional knowledge, and arrive at exactly the conclusion she needed me to arrive at. I think about that sometimes. The elegance of it. If you wanted to reach me, specifically, the roof was the right way to do it. September and October. 2 more visits. The rhythm continued. But something in the texture of it had shifted, and I noticed this without quite knowing what to do with the information. Lynn was warm when I was present. That had not changed. Attentive, occasionally affectionate, present in the way that she had always been present. But between visits, the Zalo messages were slower, not dramatically slower, not 8 or 10 hours of silence, just a quality of distraction in her responses that hadn't been there before. Shorter, less specific, where she used to send me a voice note describing the strange thing a customer had said. Now I'd get a text. Busy day, talk tomorrow. I examined this. I applied the cultural framework I had constructed. I reminded myself that I was not entitled to constant communication, that I had specifically identified this expectation as something I would not impose, or that the men in the cautionary stories had often pushed too hard, demanded too much, created the very distance they feared by refusing to trust. So I trusted. I recalibrated. I sent my own voice notes and waited and did not push. And sometimes I sat in the flat in Schiedam in the evening, the Dutch rain doing what it does against the windows, and I thought about the unanswered message from 2 days ago and felt something I refused to name as unease. It was in early October on a Tuesday morning that I decided to surprise her. I have examined this decision with considerable thoroughness since. I have been honest with myself, which is harder than it sounds, about what exactly was driving it. Part of it was what I told myself at the time. I had seen this done. A man books a flight, appears unexpectedly, the person is delighted. It is a gesture, romance. I am 63 years old and I was, in some small, embarrassing way, attempting romance. But there was another part, a quieter part that one did not look at directly. The way you don't look directly at something in your peripheral vision because you're not sure it's real and looking will force you to decide. Some accumulation of small, unreturned messages, of vague explanations, of the way she had seemed slightly elsewhere on the last visit in September, present in body, accurate in all the expected ways, but with a quality of managed attention rather than genuine engagement. I couldn't have told you what I was concerned about. I had no specific fear I could name. I booked the flight without telling her. I told myself one more time that it was romantic. I have since concluded that the truth contained both things. I was attempting romance. I was also, without quite admitting it, conducting an inspection. I was a foreman who had noticed something in the material that didn't quite look right, and I was going back to the site unannounced because unannounced visits are how you see what's actually there. The flight was on a Tuesday. I landed in the early afternoon. The taxi driver on the Hanoi Bai highway, a different man than usual, which I noticed for no particular reason, drove me toward Tai Ho without requiring the address. I had given it to him in the taxi queue from a small card I kept in my wallet with the address written in Vietnamese, because I am organized and I plan for contingencies. I had a key. I had always had a key. We had never discussed what the key was for, which is to say we had never discussed what it meant that I had one, which is to say we had never discussed what we were to each other in terms that would have required honesty about what she was to someone else. I put the key in the lock. I opened the door. A man was sitting on the sofa. Late 20s, Vietnamese. He was sitting in the way that people sit in their own space, relaxed, slightly sideways, one arm along the back of the cushions, a phone in his other hand. Not visiting, not perched on the edge the way a guest perches, occupying it the way you occupy furniture that is yours. He looked up. I have been in situations in my working life where something has gone structurally wrong, where you arrive on site and you see immediately before you've asked a single question that what you are looking at is not what the documentation said it would be. There is a specific quality to that moment, a very fast and very complete understanding that arrives before the analysis does. Then you figure out what you know. That was the quality of this moment. Lynn came out of the kitchen. She was wearing a pullover I recognized, one she kept at the apartment. She saw me. She saw the man on the sofa. She saw me seeing him. And then the three of us occupied the room together for a period that was probably 5 seconds and felt considerably longer. With the sounds of the street coming up from below, a motorbike, someone calling out. the ordinary noise of Thai ho on a Tuesday afternoon continuing without any awareness of what was happening one floor up. The man stood. He said something to Lynn in Vietnamese that I didn't understand, quietly, and she replied, also quiet, also in Vietnamese. And he nodded. He picked up a jacket from the arm of the sofa with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly where he left it, and he walked past me to the door. And he left. He did not look at me again. He was not rude about it. He simply left. The way you leave when the situation has become clear, and there is no point in anyone remaining who doesn't have to. The door closed. Lynn and I were alone in the apartment. She did not cry. I want to be specific about this because I think it matters to the accuracy of what I'm telling you. She did not attempt to construct an explanation or a defense. She sat down on the sofa, the same cushion the man had been sitting on, which I noticed and which I do not think was deliberate. And she was quiet for a moment. And then she looked at me directly and she began to explain. His name I will not give here because it is not relevant and also because I never actually learned it. He was Vietnamese. He was 28 or 29. She was not specific. He was from Hanoi originally. They had been together for, here she paused, not for effect, but because she was calculating, 3 years. Approximately, he was her boyfriend. Her actual boyfriend, she said. And she used that phrase with the kind of careful specificity that told me she was aware of the distinction she was drawing and what it implied about the category I had been occupying. She and I, she said, had been a different arrangement. I asked her to explain what that meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the careful, formal English she had always used with me, "You have money. My family has needs. You wanted," she paused, found the word, "to be useful." I allowed this. It seemed fair to both of us. I asked about her mother's clinic bills. She said, "My mother was ill." I asked about the roof in Ninh Binh. She said, "The roof needed fixing." And there it was, the complete and unreducible truth of it. None of it had been invented. The mother had genuinely had a blood pressure episode. The roof genuinely leaked when the rains came heavy. The brother genuinely rides to Bac Ninh on the motorbike. All of it was real. It was simply also true that these real things were presented to a man who had money and who wanted, in some fundamental way that he had dressed up as practicality, to be needed by someone. I have spent a lot of time with this. I will not tell you that she was blameless. She was not. She maintained a parallel life with considerable efficiency for 9 months, and she allowed me to fund her family's needs while doing so. And that is not something I can characterize as entirely innocent. But I also will not tell you that what she said was wrong, because it wasn't. I did have money, her family did have needs, and I did want to be useful. All 3 of those things were accurate. We sat in that apartment for approximately 40 minutes. I did not shout. There was nothing to shout about, in the sense that shouting would not have changed any of the facts that were now present in the room. I am 63 years old, and I have been in this situation before in a different country, and I knew then, as I know now, that scenes do not recover money or dignity. They only produce a version of the ending that you then have to carry with you. I asked a few more questions. She answered them. The answers were consistent and factual and contained no particular remorse, which I found, I'm still working out the right word for what I found it. Not cold exactly, more like the particular calm of someone who has genuinely separated 2 things in their mind and lived with that separation long enough that it no longer requires effort to maintain. I have worked with subcontractors who cut corners and then presented paperwork showing they hadn't. There is a specific quality to that kind of compartmentalization. Not the guilt of someone who knows they've done something wrong and is hiding it, but the settled self-justification of someone who has reframed the thing until it no longer appears wrong from the inside. Lynn had the second quality. She did not appear to feel she had done something monstrous. And sitting there in the apartment I had rented, on the sofa he had been sitting on, I found myself unable to construct a clean argument for why she should. She had accommodated 2 things that both required accommodating. She had done it with efficiency. She had not lied to me exactly. She had simply declined to offer information that I had not specifically asked for, and that would have ended the arrangement. I stood up after 40 minutes. I picked up my bag, which I had set down by the door when I came in and had not moved since. I said something. I cannot now remember what. Something brief and in English. Probably something close to right, I hope, though I wouldn't stake much on it. She said something in return. Also brief. I left. The street below was the same street it had always been. A woman on a Honda Wave sat waiting for the light to change. The cafe on Tuhoa Street was still open. The mist that sits over Tai Ho in the evenings was beginning to form over the water, the way it always did at this hour. I walked until I found a hotel I recognized on a street I knew, and I went inside and I booked a room for 2 nights, and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the wall for a while. Then I ordered 1 beer from room service. Bia Hanoi. It came in a can. I drank it slowly. I did not call anyone. That night, I did the accounting. Not the emotional accounting. I wasn't ready for that yet, and I'm not sure I'm entirely ready for it now. The financial accounting. The kind I knew how to do. Direct transfers to Lynn or on her behalf. 14,000 euros approximately. The clinic bill. The monthly apartment contributions. The motorbike. The roof materials. Various smaller amounts I have rounded conservatively because I prefer accuracy to drama. Flights. 8 return trips Rotterdam to Hanoi, averaging 650 euros each. 5,200 euros. Accommodation and living costs across 9 months of visits. I estimate 4,000 euros, perhaps a little more. Total. Somewhere between 23 and 25,000 euros. The savings account, the 82,000 I had brought with me into this, liquidated from a fund I'd built over the working years, was mostly intact. Mostly. I sat in the hotel room with the Bia Hanoi can, and I did this arithmetic on my phone's calculator application, which felt appropriately undignified for the occasion. I booked the Thursday flight home. Then I went to sleep, which surprised me slightly. The flight back was unremarkable. I looked out the window for a while. I did not think about Lynn specifically, or I did, but not with the intensity I expected. More with the flat, assessing quality of someone reviewing a project report and trying to identify where the specification had failed. The plane landed at Schiphol. I took the train to Rotterdam. I took the metro to Schiedam. I walked to the flat. The 2 plants were alive. I put my bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then I made coffee. I called Theo the following day. Theo, who had been site manager on the Moss Barrier project for 12 years, who I had worked alongside long enough that we had developed the particular shorthand of men who have solved problems together under pressure. I told him the full account. He listened without interrupting, which is something Theo does that I have always respected. He does not rush to fill silence with reassurance. When I finished, he said, "Ja." Then he opened another beer, which I could hear through the phone. Then he said, "And you're all right?" And I said, "Yes, mostly." And he said, "Good." And that was the conversation. It was, I think, exactly the right conversation. No analysis, no recrimination, no elaborate sympathy. Just acknowledgement, and then a beer, and then moving on. I have thought about this a lot since. There is a Dutch way of handling certain things that I think serves better than the alternative. Several weeks later, I found the forum again. The same one where I had first read about Hanoi being where it still was. I created an account. I typed out what had happened in the flat, direct sentences that I am reasonably confident will be recognized by anyone reading this as the sentences of a man who is trying to be accurate rather than interesting. I posted it. Then I went and made another coffee and didn't look at the responses for 2 days. When I did look, most of them were what you'd expect. Sympathy, warnings about specific apps in specific areas of Tai Ho. 1 or 2 that were not particularly kind. I did not engage with most of them, but I wrote something at the end of my post that I want to repeat here because I think it is the actual point of what I've been telling you. And it's this. Lynn was not a monster. I want to be clear about that. She had a boyfriend she genuinely loved. A Vietnamese man her own age, someone who existed in the same city and the same daily life as she did. She had a family with real needs. She had a foreigner who arrived in her neighborhood with money and a desire to be useful and romantic feelings he had dressed up as practical judgment. She accommodated all of these things simultaneously. With efficiency, yes. With the compartmentalization, I found unsettling, yes. But the needs she described were real. The mother was ill. The roof leaked. I believe that. What I am less willing to excuse In her and in myself is the arrangement, the sustained fiction that I was something I wasn't, maintained over 9 months, funded with money I'd worked 35 years to save. That is not something I can fully excuse by invoking cultural difference or economic disparity, though both of those things were genuinely present. They explain it. They don't entirely justify it. And the person I am least willing to excuse is the one I know best. I had been warned. Not by Lynn, she didn't warn me, she had no reason to. I had been warned by Thailand. I had been warned by every forum thread I read. I had been warned by the British man at the craft beer bar who nodded slowly and said nothing specific and changed the subject. I had been warned by my own unease in September and October. That quiet peripheral thing I refused to look at directly. The warning system was fully functional. I had just built better arguments for why it didn't apply to me. Here's what I wrote on the forum, and what I am still trying to believe is true. Experience does not inoculate you. What experience actually gives you is more sophisticated rationalizations for the same wishful thinking. I went to Vietnam a careful man who had already been burned. I came home having spent 24,000 euros in 9 months, and another portion of my 60s on a lesson I had technically already learned. The flat in Schiedam is the same flat. The pension arrives. The two plants are alive. I am, by any reasonable measure, fine. But I checked every structure in that situation. The job, the family, the transparency about obligations, the way she sat in silence, the way she laughed. I checked all of it with a foreman's care. I did not check the one thing I was standing on, which was my own need to believe that this time the foundations were sound. They weren't. They never were. I just wanted them to be. And that is where Pieter van der Berg's story ends. That's inside Vietnam's way of leaving you, not with neat answers, but with the right question. And the question Pieter's story asks is this: what is the story you're telling yourself, and who does it protect? Because in every story on this channel, there's always a moment when the warning was there. When someone nodded too slowly at the bar. When the message took too long to arrive. When something in the peripheral vision didn't quite add up. The twice-fooled man isn't fooled because he's stupid. He's fooled because he's built a better argument for why the warning doesn't apply to him. That's the specific danger of experience. Not that it fails you, but that it gives you the vocabulary to explain away exactly the thing you should be paying attention to. Pieter is back in Schiedam. He is fine. He has his pension, his plants, his friend Theo, who opens a beer and says "Joe" and moves on. He is 63 years old and he is not broken. He is, by his own description, more accurately calibrated than he was before, which is a very Dutch way of saying he has learned something he would have preferred not to learn. We're grateful to him for telling it. That's it for this one. If this story reached you, if something in it sounded familiar, if you recognized a rationalization or a checklist, or a British man nodding slowly at a bar, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've got a story of your own, you know where to find us. This is Inside Vietnam. Take care of yourselves out there.